So is audio on as well?
Mm-hmm. Welcome everyone to our webinar. We'll wait just a little more to give a chance for everyone to arrive. Okay, so welcome everyone to our webinar, Leveraging Data to Make Better Business Decisions. My name is Maria Poli. I'm the Integrated Marketing Manager at GuideSpark. While we're giving a chance for everyone to arrive and before diving in, I'll go over the housekeeping item for today. At the bottom of your screen, you can see a little QA section. You can submit any question you might have there. We'll be answering all the questions at the end of this webinar. If you use social media to post about the webinar, please use @GuideSpark or #GSWebinar. After the event, we'll be sending out the recording and the slide of today's webinar. With no further ado, I'll let our presenter Kohi take over.
Good morning. My name is Kohi Chandran. I'm a Director of Product Management at GuideSpark. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about how you can leverage data to make better business decisions. First, let me do a quick introduction of myself. I have a multidisciplinary background. I started my career in banking in New York before switching to the technology industry, where I spent almost 10 years with IBM, both on the hardware and software sides. I also switched between finance and product management roles. I then moved to GE Digital, where I helped launch the industrial IoT platform and really immersed myself in the power of using data to optimize industrial assets and processes. I joined GuideSpark last year, and I'm very interested in understanding the value of using human-centered data to drive real business performance. More specifically, I'm very interested in exploring with our customers how we can accelerate change effectiveness through communication, which is why I'm excited to be talking to you today about how you can leverage data to improve business decisions and how potentially you can run your own little experiments to see if this can be effective in your organizations. A quick rundown of the agenda today. We're gonna cover, as a fallback position, why data is important before we actually start looking at use cases. I then want to cover 4 very interesting examples of where companies were using data to make decisions. Then I found an example of a project that actually shares a little more detail to break down a data project, which I think will be very instructive for the audience today. And then we'll wind up with some takeaways, and then we'll have hopefully about 5 minutes at the end for Q&A. So I always like to step back first before I dive into a topic and level set on the why. Why is there this mega trend of using data to drive decisions? Is it any better than what was done before? When I was thinking about this, I came up with 3 reasons, and I'm sure there are a lot more. But at a high level, I think these are broadly true. First is that data is neutral. It democratizes decision-making and avoids the pitfalls that I think afflict a lot of large organizations. Things like the loudest voice in the room making the final decision, or the highest paid person in the room making the decision. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with that scenario. I think also a gut feel that has never been tested is potentially problematic. So I think data is this sort of one way to neutralize all of these human fallibilities. I think data enables more confident decision-making. And I say that because using data, you can establish a baseline of your current state. And then obviously using data and measuring a metric, you can then see what the impact is of that decision that was made. And I think it also allows for measurement and tracking of progress. And lastly, I think data, allows for broader and quicker understanding of the logic behind any decision. So typically in large corporations, a team makes a decision and then they have to either explain the rationale for that decision up to executives, or even explain to the broad employee base why a certain decision was made. And having data to back that up, having an algorithm that you can explain, I think speeds up that process. So I think overall, this trend, has been going on for a while, and I think it really has the potential to really improve decision makings within enterprises. So I want to start by sharing 4 examples of companies that used data to make real operational improvements. The first 2 are examples of companies that were using data to tackle employee turnover specifically. I think a topic that would be of interest to this audience. The next 2 are examples of companies using employee engagement to improve business performance. And that's an area that obviously speaks to GuideSpark's value proposition, and an area that I'm personally interested in exploring. This first one is from Experian, the credit rating agency. And Experian had attrition 3 to 4% higher than where they really wanted to be. And they built a model that used over 200 attributes to predict employee turnover. And so some of those data points were team size, manager performance, the length of an employee's commute. And they had multiple sources of data, including the HR system, as well as consumer profile data. And some of the insights they came out of that from that study is they identified an optimal team size of 10 to 12 people. And they were able to understand that employees who moved out of London, so this was done for their London or UK operation, employees who moved out of London were much more likely to leave the organization than employees that did not. And as a result of this project, over 18 months, they were able to reduce attrition by 2 to 3%, with a net savings of $8 to $10 million, which is not insignificant. And by the way, I forgot to mention, this project was run by their head of global workforce analytics. The next example is from IBM. This project was driven by their chief HR officer. So IBM had already done some work to identify specific roles that they deemed business critical roles. And they realized that the turnover for that specific cohort of employees was very high. And so they built a model using, again, HR data plus other systems. So plus they have an employee sentiment tool, they have an internal social media platform. So they use multiple sources of data, examples of which are, employee performance, tenure, promotion history, the length of their commute again, role and salary, among others. And the insights that they got out of this was, they were able to identify factors that were driving people to leave. They didn't release exactly what those factors were, but they understood they could identify the factors, but the analysis didn't tell them how to mitigate against it. So that was still a human process to go through that step. As a result of this project, they were able to identify people at risk of leaving 6 to 9 months out, and then obviously try to address that specifically with those individuals. Over 4 years, they were able to reduce turnover in those identified critical roles by 25%, which by their calculation yielded them about $300 million. So that's a combination of productivity increase as well as recruitment cost declines. And the last example is from, sorry, not the last example, switching from to examples where customers used employee engagement to drive business performance. So this example is from Clark's, the shoe company. They wanted to understand the connection between employee engagement and business performance. So they wanted to actually determine, is it a leading or lagging indicator? And if it is one of those things, what is the actual quantitative value of improving engagement? They used over 450 data points on business performance, store business performance, as well as people data. Examples were store productivity, customer conversion, sales and profits. And the insights they were able to determine was they again identified the optimal in-store team size. And they also realized that moving store managers too soon could actually lower performance. I think that's a very common, sort of gut feel, is that you have good managers and you want to move them around the organization quickly to spread their knowledge. But they actually realized that moving good managers too quickly might actually hurt performance. As a result of this project, which was driven by their chief people officer, by the way, that they did determine that engagement with the employees is a leading indicator for performance, and that for every 1% increase in engagement, it yielded them 0.4% improvement in business performance. So it was a real quantitative connection between those two. The last example, which ties employee performance to business, employee engagement to business performance, is from Shell, Shell Oil. Shell wanted to understand the connection between employee engagement and workplace safety. So that's obviously a very key metric in that industry. And what their project, the insights they get from their project was employee engagement is a key driver of safety performance. And then in turn, safety performance drives business performance for them. Employee engagement is the single biggest driver for individual performance. So I think that was a very key insight that they got from this. And the main determinant of employee engagement was actually the team and the organizational leadership. So how that team's management operated and what was the culture and how they managed that team from a leadership perspective. The results were, they were able to provide actionable feedback to line managers, showing them how well the engagement was. So they, managers would be able to actually see if they needed to improve or not. And then they would intervene and retrain managers who were not doing well on the engagement vector. And they actually then, fed that back and revamped their whole leadership training curriculum. So you can see that I think there is a real connection between making decisions and using data, and then more specifically, engaging your employees for a very, very specific business outcome. So I think those are great at a high level to understand that there is this connection. I think it's also useful to dig into an actual data project and see its constituent parts. I have this example here where they shared a little bit more data to show how they went about actually structuring their project, which I think will be instructive for us. So this was a global fast food chain, which had both franchise and corporate owned locations. And they had employee attrition quite well above where their competition was. And so management obviously was looking at this, and they had already gone through their sort of more traditional strategies about how to tackle attrition. And they were really looking for new approaches. So I think they worked very closely with McKinsey on this project. And management had this hypothesis that if they reduced the attrition rate, that would actually lead to better customer experience and therefore then improve revenue. So, what they did first was, before they just jumped into the data project, it was, they took the time to really figure out what it is that they wanted as a desired outcome. And they did a lot of extensive exploration and discussions with senior management. And they identified these three metrics that they actually wanted to drive: revenue growth per store, average customer satisfaction, and average speed of service. I think this is instructive because, as you think about projects that you might be thinking about launching or experiments that you want to run, I think it's really important to be to do a lot of upfront planning and have a very targeted outcome in mind, and that I think will help you make decisions through the data project as you go. So once they had identified these three outcomes they wanted to drive, they went about to see what data they had that could actually bring insight and drive these outcomes. They had some data, but they realized that they needed to supplement in three areas. So one was personality traits and cognitive skills. Some of their management had a hypothesis that personality would be a significant driver in these outcomes that they're trying to achieve. I think that's pretty common, especially in a retail environment. The other area where they needed data was a measure of management quality. In this case, the company did not have their own tool, so they deployed McKinsey's Organizational Health Index, which is their proprietary model for measuring management quality. And then the third area was employee behavior and collaboration. And in this case, they actually put sensors on employees so they could measure movement within a store and look at intensity and physical interactions within a store environment. So they ended up with 6 sources of data with over 10,000 data points. They launched this, they were planning to roll this project out in 4 US markets. And the type of data they looked at, again, was people data, shift data, and restaurant data. And this was all included financial and operational performance data by location. They really took the time to determine the relationship between the drivers and the desired outcomes. And they used a series of logistic regressions and unsupervised learning models. And they tested over 100 hypotheses, many of which were gut feelings from senior management. So I referred to gut feeling back at the start of this discussion. And I think they went about this the right way. Obviously, everyone has experience, and I believe gut feel is almost like the human brain's equivalent of an algorithm. But what limits a gut feel is any one single individual's scope of experience. And when you use actual outside data, you can then broaden that data set to really test some of these hypotheses, which I think was very, very interesting in this project. So looking at the right side of the chart, they identified drivers that would impact the outcomes, and they bucketed these in 3 categories. Drivers that spoke to who they hire, drivers that looked at how those employees were managed, and then drivers that looked at what the actual employees did. And the red dots were drivers that they determined actually did impact the outcomes. And remember, the outcomes that we're looking to drive here were customer satisfaction, revenue growth by store, and speed of service. So looking at this quickly, personality traits actually ended up, that was an assumption going in by senior management, and that turned out to be correct. Personality traits did affect outcomes, but they were some assumptions that turned out to be incorrect. So these were gut feels of senior managers, such as previous retail experience actually was not a driver. So I think that that's instructive in that some gut feels were proved and some gut feels were disproved. In terms of insights, they fall into 4 categories. So as I said before, personality traits did drive outcomes, but they identified 4 different personality clusters within their line employees: socializers, potential leaders, entrepreneurial taskmasters, and conservative taskmasters. And I think the assumption going in was that socializers who exhibited friendly behavior would impact performance. But in fact, the data did not support that conclusion. There was actually more evidence that showed that employees who had the ability to focus on tasks and avoid distractions improved performance. So those were, the potential leader category and the taskmasters category were actually better at improving performance than socializers. In terms of insights around career development, they found that various variable compensation did not impact performance. I thought that was very interesting. So individual variable compensation did not improve performance, but having an established career development path for employees and having a good work culture did improve impact. So I think that was very insightful, and that this is obviously an insight that data can only provide, not anyone's gut feel. In terms of management insights, they found that managerial tenure was debunked as a driver of performance. I think me personally, I would have assumed, years of experience in a retail environment would actually help performance, but the data actually showed that this was not a major driver. they looked more closely at the behaviors and practices and identified for themselves what a good store manager was. And so once they had identified what good practice was, they then started training other leaders on what those practices were. In terms of shift length, they found that performance dropped significantly after 8 to 10 hours. And shifts were being designed based on ease for managers and to take commutes into account. But the longest shifts actually hurt performance. And in terms of results, so this is, it was actually preliminary results only after 4 months, just in the first market, and they had dramatic results. So customer satisfaction increased over 100%, speed of service improved by 30 seconds, and sales increased by 5% by store. And so that's really very material improvements for this restaurant chain. So the takeaways I have from this is that, clearly using data to find insights and make better decisions can have material impact on your businesses. I think what I took away is focused employee engagement for a very specific purpose can actually drive those outcomes. You don't have to start on a large scale project to get started. I'm a big fan of running small experiments, so you can start small and simple. Right, so they wanted to target employee engagement specifically around workplace safety, and they actually moved the needle on workplace safety that then had a knock-on effect on actual business performance. I thought that was very compelling. I think to me, integrating your HR system with the GuideSpark Communicate Cloud, for instance, would allow you to send specific groups of employees specific content with an identified business outcome that's desired. So I think, we could partner to run little experiments, trying to see if we can move the needle on any specific business metric, which I think would be a very interesting thing to explore. So that kind of brings me to the end of the presentation. I think we have a few minutes for Q&A if there are anyone who have any questions. Let's take a look here. Seems like a bit overkill, perhaps. So first question here, seems like a bit overkill, perhaps. Wouldn't this many attributes risk delaying results? Oh, we say 200 attributes, which is the Experian example. Wouldn't this many attributes risk delaying results and potentially introducing the impact of combinations of attributes rather than discrete attribute impact? So I think it comes down to designing. Thanks, Dawn, for the question, by the way. I think it comes down to how you design that project. And obviously, you'd want to have the right data experience in designing that project. I'm a big fan of starting small. Before you launch an experiment with over 200 attributes, I'm a big fan of running small targeted experiments and ladder up to something that would include 200 attributes. But I think in this example, they probably had the right kind of data science expertise that would be able to sort of really draw attribution among those 200 attributes to see which of the attributes actually impacted performance. I think that might be the only question. Let's see. Yeah, so I think no other questions. I hope this was food for thought. This is something that, as I mentioned, I am personally very excited about and would like to discuss further if anyone wanted to reach out to me directly. But I think we can probably end the webinar right now.
Yeah, and just for those that join us a little bit later, we will be sending out the slides as well as the recording of that presentation later today or tomorrow. Thank you everyone for joining and have a great day.
Thank you.